Welcome back to the Canadian Muslim Youth Identity Project. My name's Abdul, and I'm the host of today's episode. On today's digital story, we have with us Mohamed Ahmed. Mohamed is an avid journalist who writes about a lot of social justice issues. He's also a youth worker who is heavily involved in the Canadian Muslim community within Calgary. Join us today as he discusses what motivates him to be involved in social issues, what motivates him to be involved within the work that he does, and what it means to be Canadian Muslim to him. Thank you for coming on today, Mohamed.
Thank you for having me.
What has been your biggest challenge as a Canadian Muslim?
My biggest challenge as a Canadian Muslim, I think it's definitely just trying to find my place in the community, right? I think that I've recently just gotten to a point where I'm satisfied in where I am in comparison to other people, which I know isn't a great thing to do. Comparing yourself to other people isn't great, but I know myself and also a lot of other people struggle with that. Just feeling like they're not, Muslim enough because they're surrounded by a lot of people who are really, religious, or they feel the other way where they feel like in their Canadian identity that they need to kind of push that more, and they reject their Muslim identity a lot, right? So I feel like that's definitely kind of finding the balance of I'm a Muslim and I'm a Canadian, right? Because people a lot of the time they'll feel like it's mutually exclusive, right? Like you need to fit in, or you need to completely reject this identity. But I think that there's definitely a way to kind of have both of them complement each other in a really good way.
A lot of people in the Muslim community, especially older people, they see Muslim youth and they say, oh, back in my day, we weren't this bad. And the youth, they don't care anymore and all this kind of stuff. Do you feel that this is true? Do you feel that the Muslim youth, so to speak, have lost their way? Or do you think that's not true?
I think that's not true. I think that there are definitely issues that need to be addressed in the community, both in the youth and also just generally in the community. But I don't think that, you know, that the Muslim youth as a whole are going in a very wrong direction or anything. I think it's the opposite, actually. I think a lot of the things that I see, youth in the community do is really inspiring, and I want to be more of a part of that.
Something that is particularly interesting about you is that you are very outspoken about a lot of social justice issues in a lot of Muslim countries, right? And you criticize these countries for the things that they do, and you are perhaps empowering other people to do the same. This scares a lot of people, myself included. I don't think I would be able to do what you do. What gives you the will or the drive to do that?
I think that I care a lot about, just certain issues, right? Whether it's political issues or social justice issues or whatever, right? And I care a lot about, where I come from, right? I'm Egyptian, I'm Middle Eastern, right? There's a lot of issues in those countries, from just a governmental, political level, right? I think it's my responsibility as a person who's one, interested in these topics and I'm knowledgeable about them, to, shine light on those issues, right? And also I think there's a lot of I'll give you an example, right? I really, really, really do not like the government of Saudi Arabia, okay? Because, they do a lot of terrible things. They kill journalists. They, are very big fans of bombing Yemen, right? Those aren't great things. And Saudi Arabia is notoriously, where Mecca and Medina are, the two holiest sites in Islam. Saudi Arabia is a, it's a, I guess, what people think of when they think of like Muslims, they think about Saudi Arabia, right? And I think that country doesn't reflect our values, right? And I think that it's really important that, we kind of show that, hey, I'm Muslim, but I'm not, you know, in support of these things that you might think are Muslim ideals when in reality they're not, right? I think that personally, my views align a lot more with, Western liberal values than I do with, the the values back home that are kind of instilled by governments and society, right? I think that's a big responsibility that I feel like I need to uphold.
Do you think it's your Canadian identity or your Muslim identity that pushes you to speak up and take a stand against these?
I think
Or
it's both.
perhaps a mixture of both.
Like I find the idea of like separating, my Muslim identity and my Canadian identity like a little bit strange, just because like, they're both kind of intertwined, right? And I think, like there's part like I think me as a person, like the reason I do things is because of the way that I am as a person, right? Like I care about issues and I'm, empathetic and I'm knowledgeable about these issues because that's how I am. And part of that, it comes from Islam. In Islam, you're encouraged to be curious. You're encouraged to stand up for what you think is right, right? And those are also values that I see, you know, being like as a Canadian, right? Like I think, those are values that are promoted here and, generally, kind of more liberal values, I guess, right? Like kind of having empathy, kind of, and also just being curious and knowledgeable.
Hmm. What challenges do you think Canadian Muslim youth face in Canada that they otherwise would not face back home or in Muslim countries in general?
I think, like, personally, I've lived in Muslim countries and I found my life is a lot easier here, like, as a Muslim. Like, I find my Muslim identity being much stronger here than
Mm,
back home. And that,
why?
uh, it might be a variety of reasons, but, like, I think kind of being a part of, because, like, back home, everybody's Muslim. It's not, like, you know, a big deal, right? So, like, you kind of like that's not really like a part of your identity, right? It's just like a thing that everybody is, right?
Mm,
But I think here, like I am consciously a part of the community, and I work hard to better the community. That I think that has bettered myself as a Muslim. But I also think like I personally have a lot of issues with like the general community here, right? Like I think that like as a community, I think we can be a lot more empathetic to groups that aren't ours, right? And even like to each other as Muslims, I think we can do a lot better, right?
it's interesting that you say that when you live in a Muslim majority country, your Muslim identity seems to actually be weaker. But it's very important, and I think you kind of highlighted it really well in saying that it's almost like when it's the status quo, it begins to lose its meaning because, well, everyone's kind of doing it, right? So it becomes, you know, lost in the crowd, so to speak. But when you have to intentionally think about it, intentionally get involved, intentionally put yourself in positions to strengthen that identity when you live in Canada, then it really begins to um, strengthen your faith. I think that's a very interesting point that you brought up. What role do you think you have in the future of the Canadian Muslim context?
I want to live my life in a way that is one good representation of Islam and also just as a good person, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the best way to, support my community, right? Like, I can do all this youth work. I can, help like the centers and stuff like that. But I think the best way to strengthen a Muslim community in Canada and to strengthen other people's identities as Muslim Canadians is to just live my life as best as I can as a Muslim Canadian, right? And whether that's just like, doing like just being a nice person, or if that's like, teaching people about Islam, I think that's probably the best way that I see myself doing that.
Awesome. Well, thank you for coming on today.
Thank you for having me.